Your only chance to evacuate is to leave with us. Planet Earth about to be recycled. Your only chance to survive or evacuate is to leave with us.
On March 26, 1997, Rancho Santa Fe, California became the center of a haunting story. Inside a spacious mansion, police found 39 bodies. They were the members of Heaven's Gate, a cult led by a man named Marshall Applewhite, who convinced them that they were meant to transcend earthly existence and join a spacecraft trailing the Hale-Bopp comet. Yeah, you can't make this up. Or can you? Because I'm pretty sure Applewhite did. To fully understand how these 39 people met this tragic end, we have to go back, way back, to the roots of Heaven's Gate and the lives of the two people at its center, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. This is their story, the beliefs they cultivated, and the rules that defined life in Heaven's Gate. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hi everyone, welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cult, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. Now, if you are watching this on Sunday, November 3rd, 2024, I just got married yesterday. Oh my gosh. I can't believe I'm a wife. I'm a wife. I have a husband. What? It's been a crazy year. Even crazier last 3 months. We've been together for 8.5 years, so it was just like time. But yeah, I'm married now. I'm married. It's like I can't even wrap my brain around it. So while you're watching this, I am probably blissfully hungover, eating brunch with family. So I hope I can send you guys some positive energy today as well. I will be thinking about all of you, and hopefully now that I'm not planning a wedding, I can really keep up better with the channel, because let me tell you, it has been such a challenge trying to balance everything. So thank you guys for your ongoing support. So with all of that said, let's jump right into today's video. Marshall Applewhite was born in 1931 in the small town of Spur, Texas, and was the son of a Presbyterian minister. In his early years, Marshall's world was shaped by the teachings of the Bible, the moral expectations of his community, and the leadership of his father, whose role as a minister was one of profound influence over his family and congregation. Marshall grew up immersed in the values and stories of Christianity, and church services, Bible readings, and moral discussions were constants in his household. The Applewhite family was expected to uphold an exemplary standard of moral integrity, and Marshall was instilled with a strong sense of duty, spirituality, and the belief that life had a higher, divine purpose. Marshall was also a highly talented musician, possessing a baritone voice that earned him admiration throughout his community. His musical abilities offered him a path out of small-town Texas, and he eventually pursued a degree in music at Austin College. Described as an intellect, charismatic, and sensitive, Applewhite's talent in music was matched by his knack for leadership, often taking on prominent roles in school choir groups and other musical endeavors. His voice and presence had a magnetic quality that captivated those around him, suggesting he had the potential for a successful career, perhaps even as a performer or choir director. But despite his gifts and outward confidence, Applewhite faced internal struggles that profoundly affected him. Living in a time and environment that offered no space for acceptance of homosexuality, Applewhite was caught between his religious upbringing and his true identity. This was an era when societal and religious views on sexuality were deeply restrictive. Being openly gay was not only socially stigmatized, but also condemned by the teachings of the church. For a young man raised under the intense scrutiny of religious doctrine, this conflict was painful and disorienting. He likely felt trapped, torn between his spiritual beliefs and the part of himself that was just unchangeable and very, very real. The pressure to conform to religious norms weighed heavily on him, creating a deep and unrelenting turmoil. After college, Applewhite married his girlfriend, Anne Pierce, and they went on to have 2 children. But Applewhite's inner struggles with his sexuality persisted, and he found it increasingly difficult to reconcile his outward life with his internal reality. The strain on his marriage became unbearable, and he and Anne eventually divorced. Applewhite continued his career in music, taking a position as a teacher and serving as a director of several musical and choral groups. His students and colleagues admired him for his charm, enthusiasm, and passion for the arts. But those who knew him well sensed a restlessness, a lingering sense of dissatisfaction that Applewhite himself struggled to understand. The disillusion of his marriage, combined with the constant suppression of his sexual identity, created a sense of isolation in Applewhite. He began to feel alienated from the world around him, even as he maintained the facade of a successful educator and performer. His religious beliefs offered him no solace. In fact, they deepened his sense of guilt and shame. He wrestled with questions about his purpose and his worth, feeling as though he was living a life that was out of alignment with the principles he had been raised to uphold. Applewhite's belief in a higher purpose, instilled in him since childhood, had been a source of comfort. But now it became a source of anxiety as he grappled with the idea that his inner struggles might mean he was failing in his duty to God. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Applewhite's internal conflict began to take a toll on his mental health. He experienced bouts of depression, identity crises, and feelings of unworthiness that drove him to question everything about his life and purpose. He sought meaning in various forms of spiritual exploration, experimenting with alternative beliefs and practices that diverged from his Presbyterian roots. During this time, he also lost his job as a music teacher, further compounding his feelings of failure and alienation. Now, Applewhite's life took a significant turn in 1972 when he was hospitalized for what had been described as an emotional or mental breakdown. It was during this period that he met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse with an intense interest in mysticism, astrology, and spiritualism. Nettles, who also felt disconnected from traditional religion, was fascinated by metaphysical and extraterrestrial concepts. She believed that the universe held answers that went beyond conventional teachings. When they met, Nettles sensed a cosmic connection between them, one she interpreted as a sign that they were meant to fulfill a higher mission together. This chance meeting with Nettles would prove to be transformative for Applewhite. She provided the validation and understanding he had longed for, encouraging him to explore ideas that went beyond the confines of traditional Christianity. Nettles shared her belief with him that she and Applewhite were destined to work together for a spiritual purpose, even suggesting that their bond was preordained by the cosmos. This perspective was both liberating and comforting to Applewhite, who felt as though he had finally found someone who saw him for who he truly was, beyond the religious dogma and societal expectations that had governed his entire life. Together, Applewhite and Nettles embarked on a journey that would lead to the founding of Heaven's Gate. Their shared belief in extraterrestrial spirituality and the desire for a higher calling gave Applewhite the sense of purpose that he had been seeking. He was no longer constrained by his past or his traditional religious upbringing. Applewhite embraced the idea that he and Nettles were special beings with a divine mission. This new identity, free from the limitations of his former life, allowed him to channel his charisma and leadership skills into something he believed was truly meaningful. But unfortunately, it would lead to the deaths of many people. And it just makes me start to ask the question, I suppose, of is this a symptom of homosexuality being not just not accepted by the church, but almost being seen as super sinful in certain religions and blasphemous in certain Christian circles? And it really makes me wonder, if he had been more accepted for his sexuality and could have lived up to his true self, would we have avoided this entire situation? Do you think that if he had felt free to explore his sexuality and have relations with men, do you think that he would have felt fulfilled enough and maybe never tried to start a cult? I'm kind of inclined to believe that if he felt free to be his truest self, maybe he wouldn't have created this cult. But I don't know. What do you guys think? But on the other hand, Applewhite's unresolved conflicts and his need for acceptance would heavily influence the strict rules and doctrines that Heaven's Gate would later adopt. The group's emphasis on celibacy, detachment from earthly desires, and rejection of individual identity were extensions of Applewhite's own struggles, manifesting as strict practices designed to control the very conflicts that he had fought his entire life. In his quest to resolve his inner turmoil, Applewhite would impose his beliefs onto his followers, ultimately leading them down a path that ended in one of the most infamous tragedies in modern history. So, who is this mysterious woman, Bonnie Nettles? Well, she was born on August 29, 1927, in Houston, Texas, into a relatively conventional middle-class family. But unlike Marshall, who grew up in a strict religious household, Nettles' upbringing was not really deeply rooted in any particular religious tradition. However, she was very curious and had an imaginative nature about her from a very early age. She often pondered questions about the universe and spirituality and the supernatural. These early fascinations planted these seeds of what would become a lifelong interest in metaphysics and mysticism, and it would really shape her unique worldview. She was described as a gentle, compassionate person, and she initially channeled these qualities into her career as a nurse, which it's just so concerning that she was most likely Applewhite's nurse when she met, and he was going through a mental health crisis, and it's like she exploited that almost. But what do you guys think? I don't know. It feels really icky to me. She would end up marrying Joseph Segal Nettles, who was a local businessman in the 1940s, and end up having 4 children. Now, on the surface, Nettles seemed to live a typical suburban life, balancing her career and raising her family just outside Houston. However, her inner world was anything but conventional. While her professional life as a nurse was rooted in science and medicine, Nettles privately nurtured a deep fascination with astrology, spiritualism, and alternative religious beliefs. In the 1960s, Nettles' interest in mysticism intensified, and she began exploring more unconventional beliefs. She reportedly attended seances, she studied astrology, and she often turned to the stars to seek guidance. Nettles also believed that higher forces or celestial beings could communicate with humans and influence their lives. These ideas created a divide in her personal life. Her husband, who is a very practical-minded businessman, disapproved of her spiritual pursuits, and Nettles became more engrossed in her metaphysical beliefs. And then the tension in her marriage started to grow. And this is what ultimately led her to divorce in the early 1970s. And it was a pivotal turning point in her life. Following her divorce, Nettles began to immerse herself even more deeply in the study of spiritualism and the metaphysical. She sought out books on the subjects and essentially became obsessed, and it just fueled this belief that life on Earth was connected to some greater cosmic plan. She was essentially drawn to the idea of past lives, reincarnation, and the belief that humans had celestial counterparts or guides who offered wisdom from beyond. Nettles often consulted with astrologers and psychics, believing that these figures could help her understand her own spiritual journey and possibly uncover a higher purpose. Some accounts suggest that she began to feel she was destined to meet someone with whom she could fulfill a divine mission, somebody that she believed she had known in a past life. So this belief added a sense of anticipation to her life, as though she was waiting for a specific event or encounter to set her on her new path. So here we are back at the hospital in 1972, where Nettles met Marshall Applewhite, who was seeking treatment for emotional distress. And allegedly from the beginning, Nettles felt a very strong cosmic connection with Applewhite. She interpreted their meeting as something predestined, a union orchestrated by the forces that she had been studying. And Nettles shared with Applewhite all her beliefs about higher beings, spiritual guides, and the possibility of transcending the human condition. She encouraged him to consider that his suffering and the sense of alienation he was experiencing were perhaps part of a larger divine plan. For Applewhite, Nettles represented an oasis of acceptance and validation. While he had been conflicted by traditional religious beliefs that labeled his identity as sinful, Nettles offered a belief system that transcended earthly judgments. She framed their meeting as a significant spiritual event, something ordained by the universe itself. And this notion deeply appealed to Applewhite, who was searching for meaning in his life. Nettles' beliefs helped him reframe his inner conflicts as part of a cosmic journey rather than a personal failing. So together, Nettles and Applewhite developed a shared belief system, one that synthesized elements of Christianity, mysticism, and even science fiction. They began to see themselves as the two mentioned in the Book of Revelation, divinely chosen figures sent to prepare humanity for its next evolutionary leap. While Applewhite provided the charisma and the leadership, Nettles was often the intellectual and spiritual guide, drawing from her vast knowledge of the esoteric to help shape the doctrines that would later define Heaven's Gate. In this new partnership, Nettles and Applewhite became inseparable, referring to themselves as T and Do. These are musical notes symbolizing harmony. For Nettles, this partnership fulfilled the spiritual role she felt like she'd always been destined for. And although she passed away from cancer in 1985, her influence remained central to Heaven's Gate and to Applewhite's teachings, and it shaped the group's beliefs and practices even after her death. Her role in the founding of Heaven's Gate was as much about spiritual exploration as it was about providing Applewhite with the validation and purpose that he had long sought. And together, they would lead one of the most infamous and tragic spiritual movements in modern history. So the foundation of Heaven's Gate was built on a mixture of Christian ideology, science fiction, and New Age mysticism. Applewhite and Nettles believed they were spiritual beings in human containers sent to Earth to guide others to a higher level of existence. And we have heard this all before, haven't we? So they taught that humanity was on the brink of an evolutionary leap, and that only those who severed their earthly attachments could ascend to the next level. They told followers that heaven, or the next level, was a physical realm, an actual other planet where advanced beings existed together in perfect harmony. They saw themselves as the new messengers, similar to how they believed Jesus was actually an extraterrestrial guide. So let's break down some of these concepts. One of the most distinct aspects of Heaven's Gate theology was its view of the human body being a mere container for the soul. Applewhite taught that each person's physical form was a temporary vehicle or vessel that housed an eternal, otherworldly essence. They saw Earth as sort of this testing ground where these souls, which originated from the quote next level, aka heaven, could learn, grow, and eventually graduate to a higher state of existence. In their view, the human body was a flawed and limiting vessel, and graduation into heaven required the soul to shed this earthly form in order to ascend. And this belief drew heavily on the Christian idea of the soul as the true self, and then it added in some elements of sci-fi in the sense that this soul's natural home wasn't Earth, but yet another planet, where advanced beings were all living together. These advanced beings were described as godlike extraterrestrials who had perfected themselves, and now they existed in a utopian society free from earthly concerns, pain, and even physical limitations. So what was the next level? Well, it's a physical place and a state of being. So it's literal, but it's also a metaphor. Cool. So this next level was a real place or a planet or space, and it was a realm where the advanced spiritually evolved beings lived. It was free from impurities and sufferings like Earth had, and it was described as a place of pure harmony, understanding, and knowledge. They often referred to Heaven's Gate as the kingdom of heaven and insisted that it was a physical location, which is in direct contrast to traditional Christian views of heaven as like an abstract spiritual state. But to Applewhite and Nettles, this extraterrestrial kingdom of heaven was the ultimate destination for those souls who could prove themselves worthy by passing spiritual tests on Earth. By following Heaven's Gate doctrine, they believed that members would prepare themselves to graduate to this actual, real, physical paradise that is out in outer space. So a core tenet of Heaven's Gate teachings was the requirement to sever all earthly attachments so that you can basically rise to heaven. They believed that desires, relationships, material possessions, and even individual identity were all obstacles to spiritual evolution. Applewhite actually preached that family ties, friendships, sexual relationships, and even career ambitions kept followers tethered to their human identities and prevented them from reaching the next level. This philosophy led Heaven's Gate to adopt strict ascetic practices. Members lived communally, adopting identical clothing, and renounced their individual names so that they could pick names that ended in ODY, Odie. This practice was meant to strip away personal identity and reinforce a sense of collective purpose, but also detach you from who you are as a person so that you go numb and then you can't see the red flags that are glaringly obvious to all of us on the outside. It is a classic cult tactic, and it is really, really, really sad to hear, especially knowing the outcome of this disastrous cult. So every earthly desire, like a romantic relationship or any pursuit of pleasure, were seen as distractions from the mission to prepare for ascension. So in addition to cutting ties with family and friends, Applewhite encouraged practices that further distanced members from their own human identities, which meant celibacy and physical discipline. In a particularly extreme case, several male members, including Applewhite, voluntarily underwent castration to eliminate sexual desires, which they viewed as deeply rooted human instincts that were incompatible with their spiritual goals. It's so sad because we see so many cult leaders who they kind of use the cult as a means to like do really gross things or sexually exploit somebody. But this guy, it's like simultaneously disgusting and also tragic because he feels like he is not allowed to experience the type of pleasure that he wants because he's been shamed for being homosexual for so long. that he's like, oh yeah, well, nobody gets to have intercourse because that's bad. What? It's like sad to me. It brings me back to my last question. Like, if he could have been openly gay, would he have felt the need to do all of this? But this voluntary castration, it symbolized their commitment to purify themselves of all attachments to human life, further demonstrating their total commitment to this cult's teaching. Now, one of the more unique aspects of Heaven's Gate beliefs was the idea that Jesus Christ was actually an extraterrestrial. Applewhite and Nettles taught that Jesus was a representative from the next level, who had been sent to Earth to guide humanity toward enlightenment. Now, in their view, Jesus' purpose on Earth was not to redeem humanity in the traditional Christian sense, but rather to demonstrate how one could graduate from the physical form and then enter the kingdom of heaven. Applewhite and Nettles explained that Jesus' resurrection was not a miraculous event in the religious sense, but a demonstration of extraterrestrial technology, showing humanity that there was life beyond Earth. Jesus, they claimed, was an example of what they themselves were trying to achieve: a transcendent life beyond the confines of human limitations. They saw themselves as following in his footsteps, offering the same path to their followers. This reinterpretation of Christian teachings through an extraterrestrial lens allowed Applewhite and Nettles to present their messages as both spiritual and futuristic, making Heaven's Gate appealing to people who felt disillusioned by traditional religious teachings but still sought meaning in some spiritual beliefs. So what is this evolutionary kingdom level that's above human? And is there an alien hierarchy? Well, Heaven's Gate teachings describe the next level as an evolutionary kingdom, implying that there's a hierarchy there similar to that of a monarchy. They believed that the beings who inhabited this realm were highly evolved entities who operated at an advanced level of consciousness, far beyond human understanding. These advanced beings were part of an organized structure, each possessing roles and responsibilities within the next level's society. Applewhite claimed these beings were the result of a long evolutionary process and that only the most dedicated souls from Earth could eventually join them. Applewhite and Nettles taught that ascension to this evolutionary level required strict obedience and mental discipline. Just as a person might progress through levels of consciousness or mastery on Earth, only souls who had successfully purged themselves of all human traits could ascend to this extraterrestrial kingdom. This concept made Heaven's Gate into not only a religious path, but also somewhat of an evolutionary one, with specific practices intended to deprogram the mind from human weaknesses, such as ego, emotion, and self-interest. This really reminds me about how people misuse therapy speak, and it's like these terrible people that will say like, well, this is my truth, you're violating my boundary, but that boundary is actually like a violation of somebody else's free will or something like that. And this is like, for a cult to try to reclaim the word deprogram as if all of us not in the cult are actually in some other cult, it's like a mind meld. It's really kind of clever on their part, but also very, very, very frustrating. It's like they are demonizing arguments against their own cult. When someone comes to them and says, you're in a cult, you need to deprogram yourself, they're probably like, no, you're in the cult. You need to deprogram yourself. It's just like, it's so backwards, you know, but like kind of clever on their part, but also equally frustrating. So Applewhite frequently told followers that to graduate to the next level, they would have to completely rewire their minds to align with the values of his higher order of beings. So basically, they had to let Applewhite brainwash them. And they had to let him do it because they had to let go of everything they knew as a human beforehand if they wanted to ascend. Preparing for the next level required rigorous self-discipline and a series of ritualistic practices. Heaven's Gate members led a highly regimented lifestyle, with Applewhite designing schedules that dictated every aspect of their lives. Members would rise at the same time, eat meals at designated intervals, and adhere to a strict, bland diet that was meant to cleanse their bodies. Even eye contact among members was limited, as it was considered a potential distraction that could lead to emotional bonds, something that would interfere with their path to ascension. So what is this ascension? They're just going to like a higher plane of existence where they will never interact with another being ever? What? And in addition to these routines, Applewhite encouraged thought monitoring, where followers were expected to constantly examine their thoughts for any lingering human desires or attachments. The group's internal structure was such that followers were paired with check partners assigned to observe each other and provide mutual accountability. This system was meant to ensure that everyone remained focused and compliant, free from distractions, and utterly devoted to the teachings of Heaven's Gate. It also meant that these pairs would probably report directly to Applewhite if there was any resistance from their partner. It was basically a method to spy on each other, in my opinion. Meditation and cleansing rituals were also very common. Applewhite believed that the human body needed to be purified, not just physically, but mentally. So members were encouraged to meditate regularly, focusing on purging all attachments to earthly life and visualizing themselves as beings prepared to shed their human containers. The group's emphasis on discipline and uniformity cultivated this hive-like mentality, and it reinforced the belief that they were part of a collective mission, rather than individuals with personal lives. And this is so incredibly concerning. Applewhite believed that humanity was approaching the moment when select souls would graduate to the next level, and that Heaven's Gate members were among the chosen few. This ascension, however, required complete readiness and total detachment. By the mid-1990s, Applewhite convinced his followers that the time was near, and the arrival of the Hale-Bopp comet in 1997 was the final sign they needed. He claimed that a spacecraft camouflaged behind the comet was coming to take them to the next level. In preparation, Applewhite instructed members to acquire uniforms, a symbol of their unity and readiness. They wore identical black tracksuits and Nike Decade sneakers, believing that this uniform represented their commitment to the journey ahead. Each member packed a small bag with personal items as if they were physically boarding a spaceship, which, if you're transcending the human experience and you no longer need or have your bodies, do you even need a little toiletry kit? I don't think so. Applewhite told them that exiting their human containers was a necessary step in this final transformation, enabling their souls to join the higher beings who were waiting on the spacecraft. But instead, it was a mass unaliving event. On the night of the event, Applewhite's followers ingested a lethal mixture of barbiturates and alcohol. They lay down on beds with purple shrouds over their faces and calmly exited their human containers. For them, it was not the end, but the beginning of an existence that they had been preparing for years. A transcendent journey to what they believed was a physical paradise, free from human suffering and all limitations. But you're probably wondering, how did these very, very unique beliefs attract so many people? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to go back to the 70s. Because in 1975, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles embarked on a bold recruitment tour across the United States. They were convinced that they had a message of monumental importance. They believed that only a few beings were capable of graduating from Earth and ascending to the next level. This mission led them to host gatherings in public spaces like parks, hotel meeting rooms, and community centers especially in smaller towns and cities where people were often more receptive to these unconventional ideas. They spoke to curious audiences about aliens and personal transformation and the hidden truths they claimed to have discovered about human existence. Applewhite and Nettles presented Earth as kind of this testing ground, a temporary realm in which souls were being prepared for that higher existence. They explained that human bodies were just containers that housed souls. According to them, they had been sent to Earth to find and prepare followers who were spiritually ready to leave this world and enter the next level. The group believed that the journey to the next level would ultimately involve a transformational process that required that complete detachment. Earth, they taught, was just a stepping stone, and those who followed them would be able to transcend it. So as for these small town gatherings, it seemed that these small town folk were more open and receptive to new ideas. It seemed that when they had someone coming to them rather than them having to go elsewhere to, say, a bigger city, it felt a lot more comfortable for them to attend these gatherings. And for Applewhite and Nettle, it provided a more intimate setting where attendees could feel personally engaged with them. At each stop, the two would post flyers or advertise their gatherings in local newspapers. And the flyers and ads contained very intriguing phrases like UFOs, eternal life, and extraterrestrial salvation. And so this attracted people that were interested in sci-fi and new age and spiritual self-discovery. They also had a tactic where they would go to bookstores and they would leave their flyers in books, and that would attract a crowd. And once they assembled one, Applewhite and Nettles would give talks that gradually introduced their beliefs. They would start with very familiar concepts like humanity's search for purpose, and then slowly introduce their more unusual ideas, such as their own roles as divine guides and the concept of an extraterrestrial next level. From the outside, again, we're like, this is still wild. This is silly. Who would, quote unquote, fall for something like this? But Applewhite's presence was magnetic, and he was very charismatic. He's described as having a gentle but authoritative speaking style, one that combined sincerity with a sense of urgency. He would speak about humanity's need for purpose, describing the limitations of earthly life and the desire to be part of something bigger, something greater. His eloquence and his intensity made him seem like someone who had glimpsed a hidden truth and was offering others a chance to understand it. He framed his teachings not as commands, but an invitation to experience enlightenment, making his followers feel as though they were engaging in a personal journey of self-discovery rather than joining a cult. Nettles, on the other hand, was quieter, but she projected an air of mystical wisdom. Her calm demeanor and intuitive grasp of spiritual and metaphysical concepts added weight to Applewhite's words. When he spoke of spiritual matters, Nettles would often elaborate on cosmic insights and introduce esoteric ideas such as astrology and celestial guides. To those in the audience, she seemed like someone who held ancient hidden knowledge. So together, they created this compelling dynamic. Applewhite as the charismatic visionary, and Nettles as the wise, enigmatic mentor. It's giving Keith Raniere and Nancy Salzman vibes to me, like the whole NXIVM situation where he was like the face, but she was like the person kind of behind the scenes who was always engaging with people and kind of like his right-hand woman in a way. This complementary leadership style strengthened their appeal, and it attracted people who felt drawn to their message on multiple levels. Applewhite's passion and Nettles' deep contemplative nature made it seem as though they were offering access to profound and life-changing secrets. The effect was powerful, leading many attendees to literally abandon their previous lives and join the group, hoping to attain the very enlightenment and salvation that Applewhite and Nettles promised. The audience at each stop was often composed of people who had somehow felt alienated by mainstream society or disillusioned by traditional religion, or even just fascinated by the idea of extraterrestrial life. Many were part of the growing New Age movement, which was encouraging exploration of the mystical and other alternative beliefs. The 70s had also seen a rise in the interest in the paranormal and UFO phenomenon, and for these seekers, Applewhite and Nettles' message was not only intriguing, but also uniquely timed to fit into their existing curiosity. These individuals were often open to the idea that humanity's purpose was larger than what the traditional doctrines suggested. They'd heard of reincarnation, astral projection, or the possibility of alien life, and were eager to explore a framework that offered new, uncharted possibilities for spiritual growth. Applewhite and Nettles' claims of extraterrestrial salvation spoke directly to those desires, giving their followers a path to escape what they saw as the mundane or spiritually empty reality of modern life. Nettles and Applewhite literally gave these people a promise of ascension, and it made people feel very, very special. Applewhite and Nettles described their group as the Crew, a team of dedicated souls preparing to ascend together. They taught that those who joined the Crew would undergo a transformation that would allow them to leave earthly existence and board an extraterrestrial spacecraft. This spacecraft, they claimed, would carry them to the next level, a heavenly kingdom in a physical realm beyond Earth. They presented this journey as the ultimate goal of human existence, and something that only a select few would achieve. Joining the Crew required absolute commitment. Applewhite and Nettles told attendees that they had to be willing to give up all aspects of their former lives, including relationships, possessions, and identities. This commitment was presented not as like a sacrifice, but more as a gift. A chance to leave behind pain and suffering in favor of spiritual enlightenment and total ultimate freedom. The idea of joining some special elite group that has a cosmic mission was alluring to people, especially to those who felt out of place or unsatisfied with the lives that they knew. For those who chose to join, abandoning their lives was a transformative experience. New recruits were instructed to sever all ties with family and friends and to let go of anything that represented their individual identity. Applewhite and Nettles believed that earthly attachments kept people bound to their human containers, making it impossible for them to ascend to the next level. So this detachment from the world was a vital step in their spiritual evolution, and it was framed as a way to purify oneself from all of the distractions of earthly existence. But when we come to cultic ideologies and the real intention, it's control, it's isolation. It is trying to get people to follow you so that you can gain power and income. Because new followers were also expected to donate any funds or possessions to the group, because this symbolized their commitment and trust in the mission. So by relinquishing everything they had once known, recruits were demonstrating their faith in dough and tea and their willingness to pursue spiritual enlightenment at a great personal cost. Just like, if you could let go of all of this, you're going to make room for the best of the best. And it's like, really? Now you have no family, no friends, no job, no income, no identity. They adopted those new names, and this is what marked their transition from their former lives. This process was difficult, but it was also seen as this spiritual rebirth, and it was a big step toward becoming pure and being ready to ascend. So by the end of 1975, they had amassed a following of around 200 members. So for the new followers joining Heaven's Gate, it was not just a personal commitment, but an immersive experience in communal living. Members lived together, they shared responsibilities, and they adhered to those strict rules, all intended to strip them of all human desire and intuition and individuality and just make them basically robots. The group's rapid growth added to this allure because for those already in the group, seeing new members join reinforced their belief that Heaven's Gate was on the right path. And each new recruit seemed to validate Applewhite and Nettles' teachings, creating this feedback loop of faith and devotion. The group was more than a collection of individuals. It became a community bound by a shared purpose, all united in their mission to reach the next level. But as Heaven's Gates grew, the demands of their lifestyle began to take a toll on some members. Over time, a lot of followers left. unable to maintain the strict disciplines or fully let go of their past lives. Those who remained became the most devoted followers, a core group who believed unwaveringly in Applewhite and Nettles' vision. This core group would continue with Heaven's Gate over the following decades, weathering the shifts and evolving doctrines of the group as Applewhite and Nettles continued to refine their teachings. Despite these losses, the experiences of those early gatherings solidified the group's foundation and gave Applewhite and Nettles confidence in their roles as leaders. They'd found people who were willing to abandon everything to follow them, who trusted them completely, and who were committed to the idea of ascension. Even as their numbers fluctuated, the devotion of the core members remained strong, driven by the hope that they would one day fulfill the promise of leaving Earth and entering the next level. So what was life like in the Heaven's Gate community? Well, this was a highly controlled environment where each member was completely expected to surrender their individuality and needs and conform to the rules designed by Applewhite and Nettles. So apart from having to basically cut yourself off and estrange your entire families and all of your friends, they believed that you also needed to purify the body. And if you have ever heard of the lemonade and cayenne pepper and water diet, this is where that came from. So meals are super simple, very controlled, and that food was just a fuel for the body, and eventually you wouldn't even need it. So literally, he decided he would create the master cleanse, the lemonade, cayenne pepper, and maple syrup. So if you were ever wondering on doing a, detox cleanse, don't do this one because it was created by a cult leader. Members would go on these diets for weeks at a time, and they would subsist on this mixture with no food. And if they could complete it, Applewhite was like, good on you, great job, because it was so challenging and it required so much self-control. So it was them proving to Applewhite that they were purging themselves of their physical desires and needs. Basically, if you felt hungry, that was a human feeling, and you shouldn't even feel that if you want to ascend. What? They also had to totally abandon individuality. But what does that mean exactly? Well, they had to dress the same. Members wore black pants, button-up shirts, and sneakers. And this literally symbolized to Applewhite their commitment to detaching from earthly identity. They also all cut their own hair too. So, those bowl cuts, that's essentially what everyone looked like. Now, in the final years of the group, that's when they started wearing those black tracksuits and the Nike sneakers. Something else this group also appreciated was silence. Total silence was encouraged within the group. Applewhite believed that excessive talking could lead to emotional attachments and cause members to stray from their purpose. According to him, this emphasis on silence allowed members to focus inward, purging themselves of human thoughts and emotions. What it really means is nobody is talking and sharing their common concerns or red flags about the group, so no one's feelings or intuition or they're seeing red flags is ever validated. He's literally like, hey guys, do not talk to each other. Because if you talk to each other, you're going to see I'm full of bullshit. The group also engaged in these really long meditation sessions where members were expected to visualize the next level and focus on shedding their human thoughts. This mental discipline was essential to Applewhite's teachings because he believed it helped followers sever those last psychological ties that were binding them to Earth. Oh, how dare you be human? You're only born on this Earth as a human. It's really so insidious when you just stop and think about it. I mean, it's insidious, it's concerning, it's scary just hearing about all of it. But the level of control that Applewhite had on everybody, it's some of the most controlling I have seen any cult leader. And it's crazy because I keep seeing in my research how compassionate Applewhite was. And that approach contrasted with the strict and invasive rules he imposed. So he presented himself as like so caring and compassionate while simultaneously telling people that they had to do these crazy things. He spoke to followers with warmth and framed his teachings as necessary guidelines from a caring mentor. His speeches had a reassuring tone, encouraging members to see the rules as steps towards liberations, not restrictions. And this is how he was able to gain followers' trust. But I just want you all to know that just because they sound calm, just because they sound relaxed or speak with authority or a gentle, calm authority, does not mean they know what they're talking about. It does not mean they know anything more than you do. By presenting himself as this compassionate, guiding teacher and positioning his partner Nettles as a spiritual overseer from the next level, he was able to foster an environment in which followers felt that they were loved and valued, even as they were forced to adhere to all of his rules. But it would be these strict rules and prolonged waiting periods for ascension that eventually caused members to reconsider their commitment. People didn't want a rigid schedule with daily routines and not being able to speak to each other. People missed their familial ties and their friends outside of the group. They needed that social support. And as it took longer and longer for anyone to ascend, people began to get frustrated. So the leaders were constantly trying to adapt and change their quote-unquote doctrine and their teachings. But as the years dragged on, some members just grew more and more skeptical and wondered if the goal of ascension would ever really materialize. This waiting period, combined with the absence of any concrete signs of progress, caused frustration and disappointment, and this led to several members abandoning the group. And eventually, their gentle leader would also change. Applewhite's personality and leadership style started to change significantly. And without Nettles' guidance after she passed away, he became more controlling, he changed his tone, and he felt more authoritarian, and his decisions seemed to be a lot more extreme. The followers who had once seen him as compassionate began to see him as a leader who was increasingly disconnected from reality. They questioned Applewhite's changing tone and the inconsistency within the teachings. They also began to wonder if his leadership was truly divinely inspired or if he was simply just making things up as he went along. The shift in perception caused several followers to lose their faith in him, and they just no longer felt he was the compassionate guide that they had initially admired. So as more and more people left, more people on the outside of the group started learning about the group. And some family members reached out to Heaven's Gate followers, expressing concern about their well-being and urging them to go back home. In some cases, these interventions were successful as they reminded the followers of the lives they'd left behind and offered them an opportunity to reconnect with their loved ones. And additionally, as public awareness of cult dynamics and psychological manipulation grew, members who had once accepted Heaven's Gate's teachings without question began to recognize that they were being manipulated. This awareness, combined with family interventions, led many members to leave the group and seek new lives outside its strict confines. So for some members, the decision to leave came from a deep sense of disillusionment because all of the teachings and leadership were changing or failed to deliver the spiritual enlightenment or transformation they had hoped for. But others found the strict lifestyle and prolonged waiting period just too difficult to endure. People became frustrated, and by the 80s, it was only the most devout followers who stayed. And by the mid-90s, the group's numbers had dwindled to about 40. Yet, the ones who remained were way more devoted than anyone had ever been before. Applewhite declared that the time for their departure was approaching. He believed a spaceship would come, ready to take them to the next level. So they started preparing for the event that they had been training all those years for. They wore their tracksuits, their sneakers, and prepared to ascend. Members even recorded farewell videos for those they left behind, declaring that they were overjoyed and ready to leave Earth. In these videos, they often referred to themselves as the away team, a name Applewhite coined to express their mission-like journey. As the culmination of Heaven's Gate's years of preparation and discipline approached, Marshall Applewhite instructed his followers to ready themselves for what he called their final exit from Earth. He framed this event as the realization of their long-awaited journey, the ultimate reward for their unwavering devotion and sacrifice. So to make this transition seamless and symbolic, Applewhite designed an elaborate set of rituals and specific instructions to emphasize the importance of their departure, ensuring it was carried out with dignity, precision, and a strong sense of urgency. This involved those tracksuits, their outfits, their little go bags, and of course the messages to their family. Can you imagine getting a video from a family member you haven't heard from in years who basically estranged themselves from you? And they basically think they're about to ascend to heaven, and then you find out that they did a group unaliving. It would be so heartbreaking. The final ascension process was meticulously planned over several days, with members divided into groups that would complete the transition in stages. Each group followed a similar protocol. They consumed a mixture of phenobarbital and alcohol to induce unconsciousness, and then placed bags over their heads to prevent breathing, and laid down on bunk beds, prepared in advance. Applewhite and other members who remained conscious would then cover the bodies with purple shrouds, symbolizing their ascension and marking them as graduated to the next level. This carefully organized ritual underscored the sense of discipline and unity that Applewhite had instilled in the group. Each step was carried out with precision, following Applewhite's instructions to the letter. The ritual was designed to create an atmosphere of solemnity and respect, reinforcing the belief that this was not an end, but a significant and honorable departure. Members participated willingly, feeling that they were fulfilling their role in the group's mission with dignity. As the final groups prepared to depart, Applewhite recorded his own message, describing his joy and anticipation for the journey to the next level. He expressed gratitude to his followers, emphasizing that they were all completing the mission they had trained for together. In this message, he maintained a calm and reassuring demeanor, encouraging his followers to feel at peace and to trust the process. Applewhite's farewell message served as a final act of leadership, cementing his role as the one guiding them to a new existence. His calm and almost celebratory tone further reassured those who remained, reaffirming that this was the moment they had long anticipated. In his final instructions, he reiterated the group's core beliefs, assuring his followers that they would soon be united in the next level. His last words provided a sense of closure, a confirmation that their sacrifices had not been in vain. After this event, these farewell videos became both a disturbing and poignant part of the group's legacy. For the public, the videos offered an unsettling glimpse into the minds of individuals who believed so fully in their mission that they willingly embraced death as a step to salvation. The calm, peaceful demeanor of the members in the videos contrasted sharply with the tragic outcome, sparking both fascination and utter horror in equal measure. The tragedy shocked the world, dominating headlines. Many were bewildered at how a group of educated, seemingly rational people could follow a belief system that led to their deaths. For Applewhite and his followers, however, this was the fulfillment of their life's work. And to this day, Heaven's Gate has a handful of surviving followers who maintain the cult's website and share its message. They view Applewhite's teachings as sacred and believe the group's mission remains unfinished. The story of Heaven's Gate stands as a tragic example of how powerful the need for belonging and purpose can be. Applewhite's charisma, combined with a vulnerable community, created a system of belief that convinced dozens to renounce their humanity in pursuit of the unknown. While Heaven's Gate ended in tragedy, it offers crucial lessons in understanding cult psychology, the human desire for meaning, and the potential dangers of unchecked belief. It's a story that serves as both a warning and a reminder to seek truth and connection thoughtfully. What do you think about all of this? It's such a sad and tragic story, and I know that there are family members and survivors who have lived to share their insights. So if you want a little bit more about Heaven's Gate, please let me know, and I will try to find some of those videos and maybe we can watch them together. But other than that, I'd love to know what you think about this video. If you watched to the end, just post like a moon emoji, yeah? Outer space or a star or something like that. I really appreciate your guys' support. Thank y'all so much for just watching, and I'm just always blown away that I have any type of audience that like actually wants to sit and watch me talk for an hour. So thank you guys so much. Please have a great rest of your day. Stay safe out there, ask questions, and always stay skeptical. Until next time, bye.